We have here with us Dr. Atlanyan, who is a political analyst with a doctorate degree in political science from the University of Cambridge. Her main areas of expertise are political leadership, states in transition, conflict resolution and security studies, as well as gender and diaspora studies. So maybe she'll join us for that feminism in Armenian workshop. Her previous education includes a master's degree in diplomatic studies from the Diplomatic Academy of London and a Bachelor of Arts degree in international relations from the University of Malta. Dr. Atlanyan has worked in a number of international organizations, think tanks, and universities around the world, including UNDP, Georgetown University, Eurasia Foundation, American University of Armenia, and many others. She has also been a catalyst for change in the field of sustainable business and social entrepreneurship in Armenia. She was noted for her work in this field and in 2015 was awarded as one of the top social venture entrepreneurs by the Global Food Fund? Or
Good Fund.
Good Fund, so it is correct. Good Fund Leadership Program in Washington, D.C. Dr. Atlanyan has a number of academic and media publications, among which the most recent is a Routledge series book called Post-Soviet Armenia, The New National Elite and the New National Narrative. Her talk today is Consolidating Diaspora and Developing Armenia, Examination Beyond the Political Rhetoric. She will take questions after her talk. And thanks again for your patience. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. This is an honor. Before I start, I want to thank Huri Beberyan personally, Dr. Beberyan. This is from bottom of my heart, thank you so much. Nothing makes me more happy than meeting fellow Armenians and fellow scholars and talking about issues that are dear to my heart and to my mind. I also want to thank UCI, Armenian Studies Department, for inviting me here today, which gave me an opportunity also to speak last night in Los Angeles at a gathering with a community organized by ARPA Institute where I presented my recently published book. So without further ado, let me start. I'll talk a little bit about the conceptual framework which I used to conduct the current research. This research has begun about a year and a half ago, and we hope, together with my scholars and academic friends, we hope to see some significant fruition of our ideas in the next year or two, which would be in the form of a book publication and hopefully a research institution. Then I'll talk a little bit about the challenges of the relationship since 1991. We'll do a little bit of a historic discourse since the beginning of Armenia's sovereignty in order to understand what has transpired in the past 25 years of Armenia's independence in terms of the relationship between the state of Armenia and the Armenian diaspora. And then we'll talk a little bit about the mutual road ahead, and I'm saying we because I would like to take questions and have a more interactive discussion of how do we move forward after 25 years of the existing two entities. So the uniting element of Armenians is the past. The uniting element of the Armenian diaspora within as well as between its communities around the world and the Republic of Armenia is the common memory, common history, and our common past. What about the future? Have Armenians envisioned together Armenia of the future? Have they envisioned together the Armenian diaspora of the future? Have they defined who we are in the 21st century as a nation, as a country, and jointly as a unique global entity? So before I dive into the conceptual framework, since my doctoral research was focused, and I use methodology and conceptual framework of discourse analysis, I pay deep attention to words and how do we articulate our reality, how do we articulate our existence. And when going through a lot of actual discourse of political elites produced in the past 25 years in Armenia, I came across a lot of the same resounding narratives that would drive us to the past as opposed to the future. And I want to give one example. When you pull up the website of the Ministry of Armenian Diaspora, it has a slogan under the logo of the diaspora, which says which translates our salvation is in our unity. And in many respects, that narrative of salvation, that narrative of survival is constantly present in Armenian political discourse. And I question time and again through my doctoral research as to why we continue that narrative. Why do we talk about survival? As Armenians, we have achieved we have beat the odds by creating an independent state. And what I was searching in my doctoral research in the discourse analysis is I was trying to find a narrative that would articulate the future, that would articulate where do we go forward from the 1990s. And unfortunately, it wasn't present there. And just to contrast, as I was researching other ministries of diaspora, the Ministry of Diaspora of Israel has its motto as uniting around common Jewish future. So the vision is there and the wording is there. So we'll talk about how do we create the right narrative that will create the trajectory of us looking towards the future as opposed to honing on our past. So as I mentioned, I use social constructivism in my previous doctoral research as well as for this particular research on diaspora. And I used the ideas proposed by Benedict Anderson in The Construction of Nations, and I'll talk a little bit also about the difference between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. Ideas proposed by Ronald Sunni on articulation of nation, and specifically his book on the articulation of nation, where he talks about how intellectuals are at play in constructing the new narrative and articulating what it is to be essentially a political entity, a nation, which in many respects it's arguable have we achieved as Armenians, because I recall studying in school in Yerevan, and the history of Armenia, the actual history book was called which translates the history of the Armenian people. It's a completely different entity from the nation or just from Armenian history. So again, the approach towards civic nationalism and the importance of articulating a nation, which is also a political entity as opposed to an ethnic group or the people. Fusion rather than mutual exclusivity of ideas proposed by the conceptual framework of civic and ethnic nationalism. And I'll talk about how different presidential administrations in Armenia, which we had 3 presidential administrations, articulated a completely different and often contrasting narrative about what it was to be an Armenian, because after all, Armenians are a diaspora nation. We have 3 million living in the country, and by various accounts, about 7 million living around the world. For this particular research, I'm a qualitative researcher. I do rely on quantitative data, but I believe that the word and can give us a lot of interesting insights into understanding the entities that we're studying. Consultation with relevant conceptual literature and expert surveys. A significant part of my methodology for the doctoral research was interviewing politicians. And in political science, the methodology is called participant observation, where when politicians speak, when they propose certain political platforms, where they give interviews, the information is filtered through. It is sterile, if you will. Whereas when you sit down with them face to face and you predispose them to an open conversation, the results are completely different. So the data that I received as a result of these interviews directly with the politicians was very much different from the data that I collected from newspapers, from books, from political platforms of the political parties that I studied on Armenian. And the same was here. Again, I met with a number of experts who were working with the diaspora or researching and studying diaspora to understand their vision towards the future. What are we going to be as a nation, as a collective entity in the next 20 to 30 years? Again, mixed methodological interviews, both open and closed questions. This year is very important in Armenia, 2018. we're going to celebrate two important things. First, we're going to celebrate 100 years of Armenian statehood. Actually, the mainstream Armenian political thought has it that Armenians have had a statehood in various shapes and forms for 100 years. So our first republic was 1918 and 1920. Then the second was the Soviet Republic from 1920 to 1990. And the third republic was the independent Armenia from 1990 onwards. And another important date is the celebration of Yerevan. Yerevan turns 2,800 years this year. So we're looking forward to a series of celebrations in Yerevan. And the symbolism of these celebrations is also very important. Armenia, even my book, I was hesitant about this because although Armenia has been sovereign for 25 years now, I was hesitant whether I should do it or not, but at the end of the day, I did title the book Post-Soviet because in many respects, as a researcher, I found enough data in the narrative that I studied, the political narrative, in the political culture to define Armenia more post-Soviet than anything else. So in that sense, Armenia still today lives in the shadows of the Second Republic. The hardware, the flag, the coat of arms, the national anthem, they all come from First Republic, but the software, the political culture, the style of governance, the political decision-making processes, these all come from the Second Republic, from the Soviet Armenia. And in many respects, Armenia projected more continuity than change. And interestingly enough, that same continuity was present in the relationship between the diaspora and Armenia. We didn't see massive waves of repatriation. In fact, we saw massive waves of out-migration. And Armenia was not built by diaspora. Avenues of cooperation remained the same through traditional institutions. In fact, it went beyond that. Diaspora's role in many respects was marginalized. It was defined more along the lines of ethnic tourism, if you will, and that I'm quoting one of the experts that I interviewed, and charitable donations than a meaningful, sustainable, and participatory engagement. The responsibility of this, however, rests on the shoulders of both entities, but as I extensively go into detail in the chapter of the book and continue to believe the heavy fault, if you will, of that relationship lies on the shoulders of Armenia. In case of Armenia, it was clearly the failure of the three political administrations to go beyond the pompous rhetoric and adopt actionable, feasible, and tangible strategies of mutual engagement. Beyond that, beyond us talking about strategies, there was no vision. When I try to understand, has anybody in our political leadership in post-Soviet Armenia articulated a vision of who we are as a nation in 21st century? What is going to be the relationship between the diaspora and Armenia? Unfortunately, there was none. Beyond certain conceptual papers, there was no detailed, articulated vision of what the relationship was going to be. Articulating of powerful and uniting vision, adopting sound strategies, and implementing actionable policies. In fact, I would go even further and say that the narrative that I collected as part of the research gave me this odd outcome where in some interviews, politicians would refer to diaspora as a liability. Given the human, the socio-cultural, the economic, the financial, and hence political potential of the diaspora and its possible inclusive engagement in Armenia's affairs, it was regarded by those in power as a liability or perhaps even a threat to sustainability of political power or to permeability of political power rather than an advantage. And I recollect an interview with Gagi Karutunyan, who is currently the head of, he's been the head of the Constitutional Court of Armenia, which is the highest judiciary body in the country. And at the time, he was one of the first people in the first presidential administration, which was headed by Levon Ter-Petrosyan. I said, Mr. Hartunian, was there any plan to engage? Because as I'll go further in detail, Levon Petrosyan's government was the most resistant to engaging diaspora. And he said, in fact, yes, I do have a paper which was called The Doctrine of Armenia-Diaspora Relationship. And I was very excited to hear that there was such a doctrine. And I said, where can I locate it? Where is it available? And he was evasive in answering actual detailed questions. Where can I find this document? I'd like to investigate in detail what the Armenian leaders of Petrosyan's administration saw as bringing diaspora together, engaging in the process of building Armenian statehood. Unfortunately, with about 3 to 4 email follow-ups, I never received that paper. But at least I was informed that there was such a thing, a doctrine of Armenian diaspora engagement. So diaspora's subsequent and essential marginalization from Armenia's political and socioeconomic affairs followed. It was reduced to a role of a donor or a charity organization. Lack of sustainability and poor oversight. Now, diaspora's role in ensuring economic survival, especially in the early days of independence, was absolutely indispensable. However, unfortunately, the billions of dollars, and Andriasova back in, I think, 2011 did a very extensive study of gathering information on the sheer amount of money that was invested in Armenia by the diaspora, that was donated to Armenia by the diaspora. The billions of dollars funneled by various diaspora organizations and individuals, although were of absolutely vital importance, nevertheless marginal in terms of sustainable development, because these donations often lacked clear deliverables and, most importantly, oversight. This further relegated diaspora's role as it legitimized often very poor governance and institutionalized corruption of independent Armenia's successive administrations. And this relationship status quo, the political regimes in Armenia kept diaspora organizations close enough to receive money through financial donations, remittances, and fundraising campaigns. Diaspora, or rather diaspora institutions, in their turn, remained conveniently indifferent to the real problems of structural, social, and institutional shortcomings of poor governance. And let me put a footnote on that conveniently indifferent, because by no means I want to offend anybody, but Armenian political leadership over the course of the past almost 3 decades now has been time and again using the narrative of security very poignantly. And in my chapter, I call the book of in my chapter on Nagorno-Karabakh, I call Karabakh the nerve of Armenian politics. Essentially, this conflict defines every aspect of political, social, and economic reality in Armenia. And in many respects, if you see the successive administrations, they came to power because of the Karabakh conflict. Levon Petrosyan was the head of the Karabakh committee. Then Kocharan was from Karabakh. He was the prime minister of Karabakh. And then Serge Sargsyan, obviously, he was also part of the Karabakh conflict, and he came from Karabakh, and he carried that presence about being from Karabakh. And in many respects, the political leadership constantly articulated this narrative that we cannot afford domestic instability in Armenia, as if diasporic engagement would be. But if diaspora favored political oppositions or diaspora institutions favored political opposition in Armenia, they would be warned that, mind you, we're a country at war, which we are, but mind you, we're a country at war, we can't afford any political instability in the country. So be aware. And in many respects, this has actually been a very powerful narrative at keeping Armenian diaspora institutions just enough involved to support, but never get fully engaged. Armenia's diaspora was maintained almost exclusively through diaspora financial charitable support, but unfortunately more often than not at the expense of solving real and lasting problems in the country. This has resulted in turn in reducing the relationship from possible meaningful and multifaceted engagement to mostly what many would refer to as ethnic tourism. However, thankfully in the past few years we saw some dynamic that is showing change. In the past couple of years, the status quo has been slowly but effectively changing, with some individual initiatives as well as diasporic organizations stepping up and engaging in more structural, institutional, and hence sustainable ways with Armenia. And we can talk about in detail later during Q&A which of these initiatives have been successful and why. Although both parties have equally significant roles, it was independent Armenia who set the tone, or in other words, drove the narrative and course of the relationship. So let's talk about Ter-Petrosyan's administration, which was from 1991 to 1998. In fact, the cover of my book has a photograph of a prominent Armenian photographer. His name is Zaven Khachikian. And from 1988 to 1991, Armenia saw some of the largest rallies on the streets of Yerevan. And a lot of, at the time, young photographers were out on the streets photographing these rallies. And this is a very symbolic photograph. This is done on the intersection of streets of Tigran Metz and Melik Adamian. If you're familiar with geography of Yerevan, there's a very important building at the intersection of these streets, and that's the building where the first Armenian Republic, the government of Armenia's first republic, had the residence. Yes, and and also another symbolism here is that you can see the Lenin Square, which was later renamed Freedom Square, and also you can see a child that's being held by a man, and everyone looking at that child as if the child represents the future of Armenia. So in many respects, this spoke very, very deeply with me, this photograph, and I thought that it would reflect the content of the book very prominently. So Ter-Petrosyan, his narrative, his political narrative, was very much sandwiched in between, with juxtaposing the idea of civic nationalism to ethnic nationalism. In Ter-Petrosyan's interpretation and subsequent adaptation of policies, it was not the nation that created the state, but the state of independent Armenia that created the nation. In 1989-1990, Diaspora letter, I want to talk about this because actually I was so happy that Ronald Suni or the year before that at a conference in Yerevan, he spoke of this letter. So the Armenian, the Karabakh Committee, and actually the members of Ter-Petrosyan's administration that I interviewed a few years back, they mentioned this letter. When the Armenian movement began for Karabakh to be partitioned from Azerbaijan and become part of Soviet Armenia, the leaders of these movements never anticipated that it will grow into movement for independence, but it did. And interestingly enough, a few authors that studied this movement, they were trying to understand who these people are who organized the movement. And in fact, they called it a movement of mathematicians and physicians, because out of 11 people, I believe 7 of them were mathematicians by profession, so nothing to do with humanities. Although, just a reminder, Levon Ter-Petrosyan, Armenia's first president, he was a philologist who worked at Mate Nadaran. And he also was a son of Syrian refugees that immigrated, I believe, in the 40s. Anyway, very interesting conglomeration of people who fought for Karabakh, but then it grew into the independence movement. And what's interesting is they recollect writing a letter to Armenia-Diasporic organizations requesting help, that we're starting a movement for Armenia's independence and we need your direction, we need your help. And interestingly enough, even Suni was recollecting that the response was more than lukewarm. He said that we warned Armenian young leaders who were fighting for Karabakh, who were fighting for independence, that beware, you're bordering Turkey. So even Levon Ter-Petrosyan in his interview recollected that letter and said, our independence wasn't welcomed by the diaspora. There was a lot of reservation. So just to give a good perspective, there was this overall sense that diaspora wasn't on board with Armenian nascent movement for independence. So Ter-Petrosyan's administration adopted course of action. There are no eternal enemies, no eternal friends, but eternal national interests. In fact, that's a quote from Lord Palmerston, which was used for the first time by Vazgen Manukyan, another prominent political leader in the beginning of 90s. And it occurs all throughout. If you study the photographs of the movement between 1988 and 1991, it occurs time and again. And it was a clear sign to Russia that we're moving away from the previous realignment of powers, and we want to look towards not just West, but also Turkey. As Armenia became sovereign, the diaspora shifted from being a nation in forced or circumstantial exile to a nation in voluntary exile. And this is a quote from the actual term voluntary exile is a quote from diaspora scholars who refer to the traditional diasporas are actually the Armenians, the Jews, and the Greeks. They're called the archetypal diasporas because today the demographic elements and movements of populations throughout the world leverage a lot of diasporic communities and bring to a lot of diasporic communities living throughout the world. But the archetypal diasporas, the so-called traditional diasporas, are the Jews, the Greeks, and the Armenians. So essentially, when the State of Israel was created, when Greece became a republic, and when an independent country, and then when Armenia finally became an independent country, all of these diasporas became diasporas in voluntary exile because they were forced out from their homeland. As the long-awaited arrival of independent Armenia came to its imagined fruition, it was expected that both entities will engage in a mutually agreed-upon course of building the Armenian statehood. However, the engagement was marginal and formal, and not mutually agreed-upon course was initiated. So what was very prominent with Ter-Petrosyan's administration is they didn't want to pass the law of return. It wasn't mentioned in the Constitution, and they didn't want to talk about dual citizenship. Moreover, he went further and he banned one of the most prominent Armenian political parties, and that's the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, or the ARF. What is very interesting, and I found it very curious, that when I was interviewing members of Kochan's administration, and they said that within days of Kochan being in office, he lifted the ban, and majority of the people who were imprisoned from the Dashnak party were released. So right from the bat, Kochan decided that he's going to have a completely different style of governance and style of relationship with the diaspora. He nationalized the narrative of diaspora-sensitive foreign issues. That's policy issues. Sorry. So he put the genocide recognition on the priority list of the country's foreign policy. He did that very intentionally because when Ter-Petrosyan he wasn't an outgoing president. Let's remember that he was actually forced out of power. And one of the reasons that he was forced, actually the primary reason that he was forced out of the power, is his plan for Nagorno-Karabakh. He lays out his plan very eloquently in a speech that's still relevant today because we haven't moved much with the resolution of the conflict. The speech is called War and Peace. I highly recommend for those who haven't read it to read it. It's translated into English and it's readily available on Google. Just type in Yerevan Ter-Petrosyan, War and Peace. Very eloquently, he talks about his plan for the solution of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and how he would reorient Armenia towards the West and lift off that heavy control of Russia. And he predicted back in 1997 that Armenia will become heavily dependent economically and otherwise from Russia if it continues the course of action that it continued then. And interestingly enough, in my interview with Vazgen Manukyan, who was a prominent political leader back in the day, he said that there was overall resistance to Yerevan Ter-Petrosyan. It wasn't necessarily the Karabakh issue, and that's why he was forced out of power. And it kind of makes sense because today when you look at Kazan protocols, which were proposed by Serge Sarkisyan, they're almost similar to the same proposal that Yerevan Ter-Petrosyan had back in the day when he was ousted from his presidency. Kochan's failure, so put the focus primarily on economic development. In fact, I recollect when I was interviewing Victor Solomonyan, he was a spokesperson for Kochan, and after that he continued to manage his affairs, if you will. Kochan still has an active website called Yerkrort.am, meaning the second.am, meaning second president of Armenia. Victor Solomonyan still works for him. And when I met with him, he said, look, for us, it was clear. Diaspora won't come to an impoverished Armenia. For us, the priority was economic development of the country. I said, what about social justice? What about justice in general? What about all the issues that diaspora Armenians confront when they come? And even what about the citizenship? It's important to note that when Kochan came to power, he immediately enacted the research committee to study and pass the legislation on dual citizenship. This was 1999. The dual citizenship law did not come into effect until 2007. It took him 9 years to bring that legislation, and he was already an outgoing president. So yeah, adoption of dual citizenship came also with a catch. Armenian citizens residing abroad were not allowed to vote in any local or national elections in Armenia. I recollect voting abroad for Armenia before this legislation was passed. So it was almost simultaneous. They changed the electoral code and then they adopted the citizenship law. Further, he also further marginalized diaspora role by instituting and defining diaspora's role as exclusively and solely in the realm of charity and philanthropy. Now comes Serge Sargsyan. I really was hoping I'm going to put 2018 there instead of present. I was, but now we're living in very interesting times. For the next, we're April 11th, for the next 6 days, Serge Sargsyan is officially a retired citizen of Armenia, but all the pointers are that he is going to be nominated by the Republican Party of Armenia, which is the party in power in Armenia, to be the prime minister. Now, just to remind you, back in 2014, he is on record saying when he tried to pass this new, what was called the Samarakan Barepokhumner, which is the constitutional improvements, essentially scraping the old constitution and writing a new one, turning Armenia from a presidential republic to a parliamentary republic. Now, an important caveat there is that as political scientists, we know that for democratic development, for development in general, it is very beneficial to have parliamentary form of government. However, with the state of political institutions in Armenia, it was not timely. However, he did repeat, and as many people were warning at the time, many experts and members of political oppositions were warning at the time that he's repeating the same scenario that Russia's President Vladimir Putin instituted in Russia. He passed the new constitution in Russia in 2008 and effectively remained the head of the country, the head of state, passed the constitutional referendum. The same happened in Armenia in 2015. We passed the new constitution. In 2014, however, Serge Sargsyan is on record saying that I will not seek presidency, I will not seek prime ministership, and I believe that no one should serve as the head of state for the third term. So, everyone was expected that he will step down. However, that's not the case. Serge Sargsyan's administration formally initiated a number of measures which aimed at strengthening the diaspora-Armenia relations. However, in reality, much of those initiatives were in many respects counterproductive. Creation of the Ministry of Diaspora versus appointment of Hranosh Hakopian. Hakopian, previously a Communist Party loyalist and later Republican Party loyalist, perhaps the right pick for Sargsyan and his political goals, but certainly an unfortunate one for the diaspora. I had the pleasure of interviewing Ms. Hakopian, and it is interesting enough that she is very proud of her communist past. She talks almost with nostalgia about the Armenian parliament of first convocation. If you recollect, it was that first convocation was in 1990, and we had one of the largest parliaments at the time, and a significant percentage of the members of independent Armenia's first parliament were actually communist, and so was she. In many respects, and as I'll talk later about it, this is a problem of generational change. Armenia is in a time where we need to strip ourselves off of Soviet culture, Soviet political culture, Soviet mentality, Soviet apparatchiks. And these people are still on the political arena and in a high office. And that's why I call that it was an unfortunate one for the diaspora. Under Hakopian's leadership, the ministry developed and adopted a strategy titled Concept of Armenia-Diaspora Collaboration Development, which aimed to define and develop Armenia-Diaspora cooperation. However, 10 years down the road, and the impact of this concept paper, as well as a handful of other smaller programs like Aritun, is yet to be seen, as much of the goals set out in these programs remain on paper. Sargsyan's another initiative was the attempt to articulate a national construct for the Armenians both in the country and abroad. Prime Minister Tigran Sargsyan, no relation with Ser Sargsyan, early in his appointment articulated a vision titled Haykakan Ashkhar, which is the Armenian world. It was actually for the first time our political leaders articulated this transnational understanding of Armenians. This was perhaps the interpretation of the Armenian transnation, as Tololian, a prominent scholar on diaspora, extensively talks about, and was a discursive attempt at communicating an inclusive and an engaging message. However, although Tigran Sargsyan was among the few who attempted to articulate an innovative and engaging vision for Armenia-Diaspora relations, the lack of subsequent strategies as well as policies reveals the populistic nature, and I'm sorry to say that, but that actually is the case, of this attempt, or perhaps the absence of initial intent or motivation to undertake serious measures aimed at striking a sound and a working diaspora-Armenia relations. I had the opportunity to meet with Tigran Sargsyan and interview him. He was genuinely excited. This was back in 2011, only about 2 years into Ser Sargsyan's administration. He was genuinely excited about the potential of engaging diaspora, the potential of developing a narrative that was inclusive of every Armenian, not just Armenians living in the state of Armenia. However, that never came to fruition. It didn't go beyond, as I mentioned, political rhetoric. Another policy paper or a conceptual paper that was produced by the Ministry of Diaspora was the so-called report entitled State of Armenians in the World, which is set to create a large database of Armenian communities around the world, as well as initiate joint projects aimed at further rapprochement between Armenia and diaspora. So as of very recently, I haven't seen any progress, any new programs coming out of this concept paper. And what is important to mention here is so the state of Armenians in the world. This paper was presented last year at the Armenia-Diaspora Forum, and Minister Hakopian extensively talked about it afterwards, saying that now it is time that we talk about repatriation doctrine, and then we start adopting repatriation. But she's been minister now for 10 years, and talking of repatriation only now is counterproductive in many respects, because we have had the legislation already since 2007, and much could have been done. But more importantly is that in 2015, unfortunately, when we passed the new constitution, there was another hit to that to diasporic participation in Armenian political life, and so the constitution, which was adopted, as I mentioned, is December 2015, stipulates that the positions of ministers as well as the parliamentary deputies must be held by Armenian citizens who have only Armenian citizenship and have lived in Armenia for the past 4 years. This, by default, excludes not only diaspora Armenians, but those repatriated Armenians who have another citizenship. So unfortunately, if before ministers could be Armenian, could be literally anybody who lived in Armenia for at least a few years, now you don't only have to have residency in Armenia, you also have to have only Armenian citizenship. And in fact, I don't know if you've been following the recent news, they caught themselves in their own wording of the legislation, because the requirement also is for the president. And Armenia's president has been the ambassador of Armenia, actually again not residing, but de jure he was residing because he was head of the Armenian embassy in London. But he was also supposed to be only Armenian citizen. And the only paperwork, and I've been in touch with lawyers who've been investigating this also in London, the paperwork that he produced to show that he actually does not have a UK citizenship, which is very, how to say, I want to be politically correct, but he was awarded by the Queen Elizabeth. He's close to the royal family. Would you expect him to give up his British citizenship back in 2011, which would have been the requirement for him to do if he is to assume? Well, he already assumed the presidency in Armenia. So in many respects, even this type of legislation, which is, I would say, predatory, especially for Armenians, a transnation, a country of global people, is predatory legislation, hurt the Republican Party themselves. I do hope that relevant legal experts will continue their plight and will get down to the truth and really understand, has the Armenian president given up his British citizenship as he claims back in 2011 or not. So essentially, as narrow agendas and vested interests prevailed over the agenda of national unification, all the three administrations failed both in drawing up a detailed, mutually beneficial, mutually enriching, and strengthening strategy of long-term cooperation and engagement, as well as implementing it through various policies. How long have I been speaking? Okay, I'll try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. So as I mentioned earlier, putting aside the shortcomings of Armenia's successive political administrations since the country's independence in 1991, for the diaspora at large, Armenia remains a homeland, an imagined home, of which many are place-conscious but not place-bound. For much of the diaspora, the core of Armenian identity is defined by history, culture, religion, language, and the genocide, but not the state of Armenia. In terms of civic nationalism, Armenians around the world, as well as in Armenia itself, have still a long way to go in building a successful statehood. And to do that, they must consciously walk at least halfway on the path between ethnic and civic nationalism. So past versus future, recognition versus repatriation. Reiterating a few ideas stated earlier, the uniting element of Armenians around the world is memory of common past. This is why genocide remains primary and repatriation is secondary, if on the agenda at all. Repatriation will become more significant once Armenians collectively succeed in building a democratic state with rule of law and respect for human rights. As previous 25 years have demonstrated, for the diaspora, economic development and security appear to remain secondary to democracy and the rule of law. In my chapter, in my chapter on diaspora, I call it the failed marriage, because indeed the past 25 years, when we reflect, it has been a very complicated relationship. Both entities engaged in the relationship not for a mutual benefit, but to fulfill their respective agendas. Arguably, diaspora saw Armenia not as a goal in itself, but as a means of resolving its agenda, at the top of which was genocide recognition. And this relates more to diaspora institutions. This is why diaspora as a whole, i.e. Armenians around the world, did not see Armenia and its underlying problems such as corruption, lack of rule of law, political impunity, violation of human rights. There's also the problem of an internal divide within diaspora itself, between the traditional diaspora organizations and the diaspora Armenians. In the reality of this divide, assimilation, which is defined as the main threat to Armenian communities around the world, becomes secondary to the bigger problem, which is the failure to adapt to the changing value system of the new generation. So Armenian millennials often choose to live in the future, and diaspora organizations would have to adapt to these changes and learn to reconcile with the updated Armenian culture. Culture is not static, and instead of living, breathing, evolving, and constantly maturing, it is a constantly maturing organism in this respect. So institutions versus people. Armenia can be in the centerpiece of that value system, adaptation and cultural progression. However, if Armenians in the diaspora and Armenia live in the future, generate ideas, create applications, patent inventions, the Armenian government and majority of diaspora traditional institutions live in the past. This divide, first and foremost, needs to be acknowledged and acted on. There are also different realities. Another major challenge on the path towards mutual engagement are those different realities in which Armenians of various communities around the world live, including the reality of life in the Republic of Armenia. The difference of the socioeconomic and political realities of Armenian communities around the world today far outweigh the ethnic connections that they have among their kin in the host countries throughout the world and in Armenia. In postmodern world, we have to think of new ways of aligning these communities and organizations. Alternatively, we will continue to generate more challenges than solutions, and the system will continue to disintegrate. The alarming reality in Armenia is the adaptation of the society to the poor governance of the state, the civic atrophy of the population, and the weakening resistance of the civil society. The new generation is more nostalgic about the Soviet past, as the recent studies by one of the think tanks in Armenia saw. And I was asked yesterday whether I see something coming out of these new rallies in Yerevan, but unfortunately, I want to be wrong, but I believe that we're going to have a small wave of rallies that will go against Serge Sargsyan being nominated for the Prime Minister of Armenia, but it will not gather as many people as would be necessary to make a dent in this political monopoly in Armenia that we have today. So one of the ways to trigger the process of brainstorming and generating new ideas on how to align Armenian communities around the world among each other and between Armenia is to question the aspect of belongingness. Which aspect of being Armenian could generate the highest responsiveness among the incredibly diverse Armenian communities around the world and those in Armenia and Artsakh? As the past few decades showed, ethnic connections in their traditional understanding of language, religion, culture, and history have been failing at keeping the cohesiveness of the Armenian kin around the world. The realization of this is a first step towards understanding that in postmodern, or rather meta-modern world, other points of reference must be used in order to generate national cohesiveness. Without abandoning the traditional aspects of Armenianness and rather embracing those to articulate an updated identity construct, to quick scan of modern successful Armenian generates nouns such as innovation, progression, cosmopolitan nation, and nature, and humanitarianism. And just to give you an understanding, the meta-modern world is the world where we live in this pragmatic realism, where we as a society, as a global society, confront global issues such as global financial crisis that affects every community around the world, such as the climate change that affect every community around the world. And Armenians in many respects have that universal capability of thinking big because we are a transnation. So as our millennials are entering that era, we need to follow them. Diasporic institutions need to follow them in order to keep them together, to update their identity. With that being said, Armenia has to be the nucleus of all of these, the updated culture and identity construct. The type of identity construct is inclusive and broad, and as a 2.0 software for articulation of the nation requires a hardware to operate in. The Republic of Armenia is that very processor through which the articulation of Armenian nation should occur and which must serve as a centerpiece of the wide web of the Armenian, of the global Armenian community. I think I'm super way past my time, right? All right, let me just, another important aspect is to understand who Armenia is. In many respects, when you analyze Armenian political narrative of the past administrations, they would ascribe Armenia to Armenians living in Armenia to high-estancia Armenians, yet we need to counter that narrative because today there are more Armenians around the world than in Armenia proper, and survival of both entities rests on the success of the national project of Armenia. Armenian citizenship. Another, well, I always encourage my friends who are in the diaspora to go and get their Armenian citizenship, irrespective of where they are. And I know that there's the aspect of military service, etc. So I urge more female friends than male friends. And especially now that we're seeing a more militarization of political narrative and actually strategies with the new strategy that Vigen Sargsyan proposed with Azg Banak, a doctrine that he's incorporating. And recently they've been talking about this Razmahayrenasirakan Razmavarutsun. It's essentially in schools now they will be introducing this very militarized narrative of, anyway, it's for liberals like myself, it's another alarming aspect, but one that we can live with if it is more, not necessarily inclusive, but more humanistic, which I believe is part of Armenian identity. Also, Armenians government needs to realize the plural identity of the diaspora. One of the recurring narratives that I've had with Armenian political leaders when I interviewed them, they would say, well, diaspora doesn't speak with one language. I mean, duh. There are so many Armenians around the world. How do you expect Armenians to speak in one voice? Armenians in Singapore, Armenians in China, Armenians here in California, and Armenians in Argentina, they're not going to speak in one language. We need to think absolutely outside of the box and in those meta-modern concepts of how to bring all of us together. And one of the downfalls of this whole saga is that in the past 25 years, neither diaspora nor Armenia have engaged in serious scholarly research of understanding the sheer human potential, not just quantitative, but also qualitative of Armenia, who we are as communities spread out around the world. We always say, oh, 7 million, 3 million, but who are we? So that qualitative research has never been conducted, and that's actually part of what I'm hoping will come out of the current research, where we will establish a center where we could study Armenian diaspora in depth, and thus understand how do we move forward as we unite the two entities into one. Reinventing platforms and paving new avenues. Essentially, what I just said. I just want to very quickly, because I would love for us to engage in Q&A. Sorry. So just very quickly, I want to talk about the meaningful engagement. It is very likely that the active body of diaspora Armenians who live, work, and or undertake various projects in and with Armenia will be the driving force behind encouraging diaspora organizations to engage in Armenia's affairs in a meaningful way. This meaningful and sustainable engagement can come about only when structural, institutional problems are openly discussed and critically assessed. Diaspora organizations must realize that it is not only the diaspora-Armenia relationship that is at stake, but their very own viability. It is time to be brutally honest. And I also like the word of Armenian ecosystem because of so many diverse elements in our communities around the world. As we imagine a new Armenia or a new Armenian ecosystem, we need to work in the direction of constructing it, whereby the centerpiece of the institutional hub of this ecosystem is a modern and democratic Armenia focused on its sustainable development and its global mission to strengthen its communities around the world. Thank you. Sorry, I went over time. I'm really sorry.